As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, Private James O'Connor stood at the edge of history, facing the daunting shores of Normandy. In the heart of World War II's most pivotal battle, he would discover the true meaning of courage, brotherhood, and the fierce will to survive. The night air was thick with anticipation and the faint, salty tang of the sea. Inside the cramped confines of the transport ship, Private James O'Connor sat with his back against the cold metal wall, his rifle nestled between his knees. The murmurs and muffled coughs of his fellow soldiers filled the space, a low hum of nervous energy that seemed to reverberate through the hull. Beside him, his best friend, Corporal Michael "Mickey" Sullivan, was double-checking his equipment for the umpteenth time. "You think the Jerrys know what's coming for them?" Mickey asked, not looking up from his task. James shrugged, his gaze fixed on a small photograph he held in his trembling hand. It was a picture of his young wife, Mary, taken just a week before he'd shipped out. "I hope not," he replied softly, "for our sake." The ship rocked gently, a reminder of the unseen and vast expanse of the English Channel that lay between them and their destination, Normandy. The word had been a constant whisper among the ranks, a name that signified both hope and dread. Sergeant Davis, a seasoned veteran who had seen action in North Africa, paced in front of the men. His voice, roughened by years of shouting orders, broke the tense silence. "Listen up, boys. This is it. The big one. Tomorrow morning, we'll be hitting Omaha Beach. It's going to be tough. Probably the toughest thing you'll ever face. But remember why you're here. Remember what you're fighting for." The men listened, some nodding, others staring at the floor. James thought of Mary again, of his small hometown in Pennsylvania, and of the freedom he had taken for granted. As the briefing ended, the soldiers began to settle in for the night. Some tried to sleep, others whispered to each other, exchanging fears and reassurances. James leaned back, closing his eyes, but sleep eluded him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, images of what the next day might bring. The ship's engine hummed, a constant reminder of their inexorable progress towards the shores of France. Around him, the men of his unit, the 29th Infantry Division, tried to rest. They were a patchwork of backgrounds and experiences, drawn together by the war. There was Private Martinez, who had joined the Army straight out of high school in Texas, and Lieutenant Jenkins, a stern but fair leader who had left a teaching job in Virginia to serve his country. Their stories were different, but tonight they were united by a common purpose. They were part of something much bigger than themselves, a vast Allied effort that had been months in the planning. James felt a surge of pride, mixed with fear at the thought. Mickey leaned over, breaking his reverie. "Hey, James, you ever think about what you'll do when this is all over?" James opened his eyes and looked at his friend. "Yeah, I do. I want to go back home, start a family, live a quiet life." Mickey smiled wistfully. "Sounds nice. I'd like to just sit in a peaceful field, no more gunfire, no more explosions, just silence." The conversation drifted off as the two friends lost themselves in their own thoughts. Outside, the night deepened, the stars obscured by a veil of clouds. As dawn approached, a sense of unease settled over the ship. The men were roused from their fitful slumber, and the final preparations began. They donned their gear, checked their weapons, and lined up on deck. The sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn casting a pale light over the choppy waters. James stood among his brothers in arms, his heart pounding in his chest. They were moments away from embarking on one of the greatest military operations in history. He thought of Mary's smile, of his hometown, and of the world he hoped to return to. As the coastline of Normandy appeared on the horizon, a voice crackled over the ship's intercom. "All units, stand by. Operation Overlord is about to commence. In that instant, James knew that their lives would forever be changed. They had trained, prepared, and now the moment of truth was upon them. They were no longer just soldiers. They were part of a monumental struggle for freedom. And as the ship neared the shore, with the sound of distant artillery beginning to rumble, they were ready. Ready to face whatever lay ahead, together. The darkness of night was giving way to the dim light of early morning as the transport ship, along with countless others, plowed steadily through the waters of the English Channel. The sea was rough, with waves that rocked the vessel, eliciting groans of discomfort from some of the men. Private James O'Connor stood near the railing, staring into the murky depths, his thoughts turbulent as the sea beneath him. Corporal Michael Mickey Sullivan joined him, handing him a half-eaten chocolate bar. "Breakfast of champions," he said with a wry smile. James accepted it, managing a weak smile in return. The simple act of sharing chocolate felt oddly comforting amidst the uncertainty. Around them, the ship was a hive of activity. Men were checking and rechecking their gear, some trying to catch a few more minutes of sleep, others silently praying or lost in their own thoughts. The air was thick with a mix of diesel fuel, sea spray, and the faint odor of fear. Lieutenant Jenkins moved through the ranks, offering words of encouragement. "Remember, men, stay focused. Stick to your training. Look out for each other." His voice, firm and confident, seemed to steady the nerves of many. As the sky lightened, the outlines of other ships became visible, an immense armada stretching as far as the eye could see. James felt a surge of solidarity, realizing the scale of the operation they were part of. He thought of the men on those other ships, each with their own hopes, fears, and loved ones waiting back home. The rumble of aircraft overhead drew their attention. A formation of Allied bombers was heading towards France, a prelude to their own arrival. James watched them, a sense of awe mingling with his apprehension. The scale of the operation was staggering. It was a concerted effort of air, land, and sea forces, the likes of which the world had never seen. Sergeant Davis joined them at the railing, his gaze following the bombers. "Those boys up there are going to soften up the defenses for us. By the time we hit the beach, the Germans won't know what hit them." Despite the sergeant's confident words, James knew the reality could be different. The Germans were well entrenched, and they had been preparing for an invasion. The uncertainty of what awaited them on the beach gnawed at him. The sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the choppy waters. The men were called to a final briefing. Maps were laid out, and the officers went over the plan once more. They were to land on Omaha Beach, where the resistance was expected to be fierce. The objective was to secure the beachhead and then move inland. James listened intently, committing every detail to memory. The success of the mission depended on each man doing his part. He looked around at his fellow soldiers, their faces set with determination. They were a band of brothers, bound together by a common purpose. The coastline of Normandy was now visible in the distance, a thin, dark line against the lighter horizon. The enormity of what they were about to undertake settled over James like a heavy cloak. This was no longer a training exercise or a hypothetical scenario. This was real, and the lives of thousands of men hung in the balance. As they neared the shore, the sounds of distant artillery and gunfire became audible, a grim reminder of the battle that lay ahead. The men were silent now, each lost in his own thoughts, mentally preparing for what was to come. The ship slowed and the ramp began to lower. James took a deep breath, clutching his rifle tightly. This was it, the moment they had been training for. As the ramp hit the water, creating a path to the beach, Sergeant Davis's voice cut through the tension. "Let's go, boys, for freedom and for those we love." With a final look at Mickey, James stepped forward, descending into the cold waters of the channel, the sounds of battle growing louder with each step. They were no longer just crossing a body of water, they were crossing into history. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon as the landing craft approached Omaha Beach. The sea was rough, and the small boat bucked and swayed, making many of the men queasy. Private James O'Connor gripped the side of the craft, trying to steady himself against the violent motion. Beside him, Corporal Michael "Mickey" Sullivan was muttering a prayer under his breath. The roar of the boat's engine was almost drowned out by the cacophony of explosions and machine gun fire that filled the air. The German defenses had opened up in full force, greeting the first wave of Allied troops with a hail of bullets and shells. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of men shouting. Lieutenant Jenkins stood at the front of the craft, yelling over the din. "Get ready, men! When this ramp drops, you move fast. Stick to the plan." His voice was tense but controlled, a beacon of steadiness amidst the chaos. As the craft neared the beach, the ramp dropped with a thunderous crash, exposing the soldiers to a barrage of enemy fire. "Go! Go! Go!" Jenkins shouted, as the first of the men began to pour out of the boat. James took a deep breath and followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment his boots hit the water, a cold shock ran through him. The water was waist deep, and he struggled to move forward under the weight of his gear. All around him, the beach was a scene of utter chaos. Men were falling, struck down by enemy bullets, while others pushed forward, returning fire. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded and the relentless staccato of machine gun fire. James kept his head down, moving forward as best he could. Beside him, Mickey was doing the same, his face set in a grimace of determination. They had trained for this, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of it. The beach was strewn with obstacles, barbed wire, mines, and the fearsome Czech hedgehogs. The Germans had turned the beach into a fortress, and every step forward was bought with blood and sweat. James and Mickey managed to reach the relative cover of a large piece of wreckage. They crouched behind it, catching their breath. James checked his rifle, ensuring it was still functional despite the soaking it had received. Sergeant Davis appeared beside them, his face smeared with dirt and blood. "We need to move up. Can't stay pinned here. We have to take out those machine gun nests." His voice was almost drowned out by the roar of a nearby explosion. James nodded, his mind racing. The training kicked in, and he moved on instinct. He followed Davis, moving from cover to cover, trying to get closer to the German defenses. The noise was deafening, the air thick with smoke and the smell of death. Up ahead, a group of men from their division had managed to breach a section of barbed wire. James and Mickey joined them, helping to widen the gap. They pushed forward, inch by painstaking inch. The German fire was relentless, but the Allied forces were making progress. Tanks and more infantry were landing, adding their firepower to the fight. James and Mickey found themselves in a small group, led by Lieutenant Jenkins, advancing towards one of the enemy bunkers. Jenkins signaled to the group, "We need to flank them. Lay down covering fire while two of us advance." His voice was calm, belying the danger of the situation. James and another soldier, Private Martinez, volunteered to advance. They moved in a crouch, staying as low as possible. The ground was littered with the bodies of their comrades, a stark reminder of the cost of each step forward. As they neared the bunker, James felt a surge of fear and adrenaline. He exchanged a glance with Martinez, and then they were moving, rushing the last few yards to the bunker, firing as they went. The return fire was immediate and intense, but they kept moving. James felt a bullet whiz past his ear, so close he could feel the air move. But they reached the bunker, tossing grenades inside before diving for cover. The explosion was satisfyingly loud, and when the smoke cleared, the machine gun was silent. They had taken the bunker. Jenkins joined them, clapping James on the shoulder. "Good work, men. Let's keep moving." As they advanced, the beach behind them was slowly being transformed. What had been a scene of chaos was now a busy thoroughfare of men and machines. The tide of the battle was turning, but at a high cost. James looked back at the water, now stained red with blood, and then forward to the cliffs that loomed ahead. The fight was far from over, but they had made it off the beach. They had survived the first hurdle. But as he looked around at the faces of his comrades, grimy and exhausted, he knew that the true cost of this day would be felt for years to come. For now, though, they had a job to do. They had to keep moving, keep fighting. For each other, for those who had fallen, and for the world they hoped to save. The battle raged on as Private James O'Connor and his unit moved beyond the blood-soaked sands of Omaha Beach. The landscape ahead was a maze of hedgerows and rolling fields, scarred by the brutality of war. German gunfire cracked through the air, an omnipresent threat as the soldiers advanced. James, alongside Corporal Mickey Sullivan and their squad, was tasked with clearing a series of German strongpoints that dotted the countryside. Each step forward was measured and fraught with danger. The hedgerows, while providing cover, also concealed enemy soldiers, turning each new section into a potential ambush. Sergeant Davis led them, his experience evident in the way he navigated the treacherous terrain. "Stay sharp, keep your spacing, and cover each other," he instructed, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. They came upon a small farmhouse, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes. James felt a knot of tension in his stomach as they approached. The building could be sheltering German soldiers, and they needed to clear it before moving on. Mickey nudged James, signaling him to take point. With a deep breath, James edged forward, his rifle raised. He reached the door and kicked it open, rushing inside with Mickey right behind him. The interior was a scene of disarray, furniture overturned, and the remnants of a hastily abandoned meal on the table. They cleared each room, finding it empty of enemy soldiers but heavy with the sense of recent occupation. "Clear!" James called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. As they exited the farmhouse, a sudden burst of machine gun fire erupted from a nearby barn. The squad hit the ground, bullets whistling overhead. Lieutenant Jenkins, positioned at the rear, called out commands. "Martinez, O'Connor, flank left, Davis, Sullivan, right. We'll pin them down." James and Private Martinez crawled through the underbrush, the sound of gunfire ringing in their ears. They reached a position with a clear view of the barn. James signaled to Martinez, and on the count of 3, they rose, firing at the barn's windows. The return fire ceased momentarily, giving the rest of the squad the chance to move up. They converged on the barn, grenades ready. With a series of deafening explosions, the barn was engulfed in smoke and debris. The squad moved in cautiously, finding 2 German soldiers stunned and disoriented. They were quickly disarmed and taken prisoner. Sergeant Davis gave James a nod of approval. "Good work. Let's keep moving. We need to join up with the rest of the company." As they advanced through the Norman countryside, the sounds of battle grew more intense. Artillery fire shook the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and cordite. They reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Below them, a fierce battle was underway. American and German forces were engaged in a deadly dance of advance and retreat, the outcome hanging in the balance. James watched, his heart heavy. The cost of this day was already too high, and yet the fight continued. He thought of the friends he had already lost, their faces forever etched in his memory. The squad was called into action again. A German counterattack was threatening to overrun a nearby American position. They moved quickly, joining the fray, their rifles adding to the chorus of gunfire. The battle was chaotic, a blur of movement and noise. James fired at shadowy figures in the distance, his mind focused solely on survival and protecting his brothers in arms. At one point, he found himself back to back with Mickey, their ammunition running low. "We're not going down without a fight, right, James?" Mickey shouted over the din. "Not a chance," James replied, a fierce determination in his voice. Just when it seemed the Germans would overrun them, the roar of aircraft engines filled the sky. American P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down, their machine guns strafing the German positions. The tide of the battle turned, and the German forces began to retreat. The squad regrouped, panting and exhausted. They had held their position, but the victory was bittersweet. The ground was littered with the fallen, a stark reminder of the day's cost. Lieutenant Jenkins gathered the men. "We did what we had to do, men. We'll hold this position until reinforcements arrive. Rest up and stay alert. The day's not over yet." As night began to fall, James sat with his back against a tree, Mickey beside him. They were silent, each lost in their thoughts. The events of the day played over in James's mind, a relentless loop of gunfire, explosions, and the faces of friends and foes alike. The fight for survival had taken everything they had, and more, but they had persevered. They had faced the worst and had come out alive. Yet, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, James knew that this was just the beginning. The road to victory would be long and fraught with more days like this. For now, they were alive. They had survived the first day of the Normandy landings. But tomorrow, the fight would continue, and they would face it together as a band of brothers forged in the fires of war. As dusk settled over the Norman countryside, casting long shadows across the fields, the intensity of the day's fighting began to wane. Private James O'Connor, his uniform stained with dirt and sweat, leaned against the weathered wall of a captured German bunker. The sounds of distant artillery were a stark reminder that the battle for Normandy was far from over, but for the moment there was a lull in the fighting. Beside him, Corporal Mickey Sullivan was inspecting a small tear in his sleeve, his face etched with fatigue. Around them, the rest of their squad was taking advantage of the brief pause. Some tended to their wounds, others checked their equipment, and a few simply sat in silence, staring into the distance, lost in their own thoughts. Sergeant Davis was speaking quietly with Lieutenant Jenkins a few feet away. Their conversation, while hushed, carried a sense of urgency. James knew that plans for the next push were already underway. The respite was just that, a fleeting moment of calm in the storm. James's thoughts drifted to home. He pictured his wife Mary, her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed. He wondered what she was doing at that very moment, unaware of the hell he had just lived through. The thought of her, of the life they had planned together, was a beacon of hope in the darkness of war. Mickey nudged him, breaking his reverie. "Hey, you thinking about Mary?" he asked, a knowing look in his eyes. James nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, just hoping she's all right." Mickey clapped him on the shoulder. "She'll be fine. We just gotta make it through this, and then you can tell her all about it." The two friends sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The camaraderie they shared, forged through the trials of battle, was a source of strength. They were more than just soldiers fighting side by side. They were brothers in arms. Private Martinez joined them, offering a crumpled pack of cigarettes. "Got these off a German. Anyone want one?" he asked, his voice weary but light. James shook his head, but Mickey took one, lighting it and taking a deep drag. "Thanks, Martinez. Needed that." As they sat there, a field medic approached, his Red Cross armband stained with blood. He moved methodically through the ranks, offering aid where he could. When he reached James and his group, he paused, assessing them with a practiced eye. "You guys all right?" he asked, his tone professional yet kind. "We're holding up," James replied, glancing at his comrades. The medic nodded, handing them a small flask of water. "Stay hydrated, and let me know if you need anything." As night fell, the stars began to twinkle in the sky, a stark contrast to the devastation on the ground. James looked up at them, wondering if Mary was looking at the same stars. It was a comforting thought, a connection to a world far removed from the horrors of war. The moment of respite was brief, but it offered a chance to breathe, to reflect, and to brace for the challenges ahead. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, more danger. But for now, James and his fellow soldiers took solace in the quiet, in the companionship, and in the shared hope of a brighter future. The new dawn broke with a crisp clarity over the Norman countryside, its gentle light belying the tumult of the previous day. Private James O'Connor and his squad, having spent a restless night in the hastily secured German bunker, were roused by the distant sound of engines. Reinforcements were arriving, a much-needed infusion of men and machinery to bolster the weary ranks of the Allies. As they emerged from their makeshift shelter, the sight that greeted them was one of organized chaos. Trucks, tanks, and fresh troops were streaming onto the beachhead, their movements orchestrated by the shouts of officers and the guiding hands of signalmen. James watched as a Sherman tank rumbled past, its crew waving to the infantrymen. The arrival of these armored beasts was a morale boost. It meant more firepower and better support as they pushed inland. Sergeant Davis gathered the squad. "All right, listen up. We've got fresh orders. We're to join the push towards Vierzeville-sur-Mer. Armor's going to lead the way, but expect heavy resistance. The Germans aren't going to give up easily." The men nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and the weariness of soldiers who had seen too much. James checked his rifle, ensuring it was ready for the day's challenges. Beside him, Mickey Sullivan cracked a joke, trying to lighten the mood, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The squad fell in behind a platoon of tanks, moving out across the fields. The landscape was a patchwork of hedgerows and orchards, a picturesque setting marred by the scars of battle. They moved cautiously, aware that every hedgerow could conceal a German machine gun nest or sniper. As they approached Vierzeville-sur-Mer, the sound of gunfire grew louder. They were closing in on a German defensive line, a stubborn obstacle that had to be overcome. Lieutenant Jenkins raised his hand, signaling a halt. "Davis, take your squad and flank to the right. We need to root out those machine guns before the tanks can move up." Davis nodded, motioning for James, Mickey, and the rest of the squad to follow him. They moved off the road, using the hedgerows for cover as they advanced towards the enemy positions. The crack of a sniper's rifle split the air, and the squad hit the ground. Bullets whistled overhead, kicking up dirt and leaves. James crawled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. They had to neutralize that sniper. Spotting a flash from a distant tree line, James motioned to Mickey and Martinez. With covering fire from the rest of the squad, they darted forward, zigzagging to make themselves harder targets. They reached the tree line and began to search for the sniper. It was a tense, dangerous game of cat and mouse. Finally, they spotted him, hidden in a camouflaged nest. A well-aimed grenade ended the threat, and the squad regrouped, pushing forward. The German machine gun nests were well hidden, but the combined efforts of the infantry and the tanks began to take their toll. One by one, the nests were silenced, their crews either surrendering or falling to the relentless Allied advance. As they cleared the last of the German defenses, the path to Vierzeville-sur-Mer opened up. The tanks rolled forward, their engines roaring triumphantly. The infantrymen followed, their spirits lifted by the success of the assault. But the victory was not without cost. As they moved through the captured positions, they found the bodies of both German and American soldiers, a somber reminder of the price of war. James felt a mix of emotions as he looked at the fallen. Relief that the objective had been achieved, sadness for the lives lost, and a deep-seated resolve to see this through, to honor the sacrifices made by so many. The squad reached the outskirts of Vierville-sur-Mer by midday. The town had been heavily fortified by the Germans, but the combined might of the Allied forces had proven too much for them. Street by street, building by building, the town was secured. As they paused in the shadow of a bullet-riddled building, James looked around at his fellow soldiers. They were tired, dirty, and many were nursing injuries, but there was a sense of accomplishment in their eyes. They had done what had seemed impossible just days before. Sergeant Davis addressed the men. "You did good today. We all did. But this is just the beginning. There's a long road ahead to Berlin." James knew Davis was right. The battle for Normandy was far from over, and there would be many more days of fighting ahead. But for now, they had a moment to catch their breath, to regroup and prepare for the next push. As they settled down for a brief rest, James thought of home, of Mary, and of the day when he could return to her. But that day was still a distant dream. For now, there was only the war, the brotherhood of his fellow soldiers, and the determination to see this through to the end. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields and ruins of Vierville-sur-Mer. The town, now largely secure, was a testament to the ferocity of the day's battles. Private James O'Connor, his uniform stained and tattered, watched as squads of men moved methodically through the streets, clearing any remaining pockets of German resistance. Sergeant Davis gathered his squad for a briefing. "We've got one last push for today," he said, his voice carrying the weight of fatigue. "Intelligence suggests there's a small German unit dug in near the beach. They're cut off from their main force, but they're holding up the consolidation of our beachhead. We need to flush them out." James listened intently, feeling the familiar churn of adrenaline in his stomach. The day had been long and brutal, but the importance of their task was clear. Securing the beachhead was crucial for the arrival of further reinforcements and supplies. As they approached the beach, the sounds of the day's fighting began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic lapping of waves against the shore. The beauty of the scene stood in stark contrast to the violence and chaos that had unfolded earlier. The squad moved with practiced caution, their eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of the enemy. James felt a sense of eerie calm, the tension of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. They reached a cluster of sand dunes, behind which the German unit was believed to be hiding. Lieutenant Jenkins signaled for 2 teams to flank the dunes while the rest provided covering fire. James joined Mickey and Martinez as they crawled through the underbrush, moving slowly towards the dunes. Every sense was heightened, every sound and movement magnified in the quiet of the approaching evening. As they neared the top of the dune, a burst of gunfire erupted. Bullets kicked up sand around them as they returned fire. James felt a surge of fear and adrenaline as he fired towards the source of the shots. The battle was brief, but intense. The German unit, realizing they were outflanked and outgunned, soon surrendered. James and his squad mates cautiously approached the enemy soldiers, disarming them and leading them back to the Allied lines. With the beachhead now fully secured, there was a palpable sense of relief among the men. The day's objectives had been achieved, but at a great cost. The beach and the fields beyond were littered with the remnants of the battle, spent cartridges, damaged equipment, and the graves of fallen soldiers. As the squad regrouped, Sergeant Davis addressed them. "You men did an outstanding job today. Thanks to your efforts, the beachhead is secure. This is a crucial step in the liberation of Europe. Get some rest." Tomorrow, we move inland." The men nodded, too exhausted for words. As night fell, they found spots to rest, using their packs as pillows and their jackets as blankets. Despite the discomfort, sleep came quickly, born of sheer exhaustion. James lay awake for a while, staring up at the star-filled sky. He thought of the men who had fallen that day, their sacrifice not just a military necessity, but a testament to human courage and resilience. He thought of Mickey, Martinez, and the others in his squad. They had started as strangers, but the trials of battle had forged them into something more, a brotherhood. They were united by a shared experience that few could understand. And he thought of Mary, her image a beacon of hope in the darkness. He clung to the thought of her, of a future where the world was at peace, and they could be together again. Finally, as the sounds of the night enveloped him, James drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but for now, he and his comrades had earned a moment of rest, a brief respite in the long journey towards victory. As darkness enveloped the Normandy landscape, the tumultuous events of D-Day gradually receded, giving way to a somber stillness. Private James O'Connor lay on the ground, his body aching and his mind teeming with the day's harrowing experiences. The rhythmic sound of the waves lapping against the shore provided a stark contrast to the earlier cacophony of battle. Beside him, Corporal Mickey Sullivan was silently staring at the night sky, a distant look in his eyes. The two friends, along with their squad, were sprawled out in an improvised encampment near the beach, the exhaustion of combat weighing heavily upon them. Sergeant Davis, ever the watchful leader, moved quietly among his men, ensuring everyone was accounted for and as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. He paused beside James and Mickey, offering a weary nod of acknowledgement. "Rest up," he said softly. "You both did good today. We all did." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of shared understanding and respect forged in the crucible of combat. James nodded in response, his thoughts drifting to the men who hadn't made it, their sacrifices a constant reminder of the brutal cost of war. Around them, other soldiers were settling in for the night, their silhouettes barely discernible in the moonlight. Some were quietly talking, others were lost in their thoughts, and a few were writing letters home, their pens illuminating faint glows in the darkness. James thought about home, about Mary. He imagined her going about her day, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded across the ocean. He pictured her smile, the sound of her laugh, the warmth of her embrace, all distant yet vivid memories that provided a small measure of comfort in the midst of war. The reality of their situation was stark and unyielding. They were far from home, in a foreign land, fighting a war that had already claimed too many lives. Yet, amidst the uncertainty and fear, there was a sense of purpose, a belief in the cause they were fighting for. As he lay there, the fatigue of the day finally overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep, the sounds of the night lulling him into a temporary escape from the rigors of war. The night on Normandy's beaches was a poignant interlude, a time for rest and reflection. It was a momentary pause in the relentless march of war, a brief respite that allowed the soldiers to gather their strength for the challenges that lay ahead. In the darkness, under the vast expanse of the starlit sky, they were united not just as soldiers, but as guardians of hope in a world torn apart by conflict.